Dead Men's Secrets, or Dead Men Tell Tales. You've probably watched PBS a time or two and seen a special or some kind of a TV documentary, that details, in some regard, some ancient relics, some ancient buildings, like the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And then they'll give you the numbers that go along with it, like this is the most massive building ever built in the history of the world to this day, as I speak to you today, as you're listening. The Great Pyramid of Cheops is the most massive building. Until about 1935, it was also the tallest building ever built in the world, until the Empire State Building was built back in 1935. The Great Pyramid was the biggest, tallest building in the world. And they'll tell you, some statistics and one thing and another, and then we sit here in awe, and we kind of marvel, because you see, when we go to public school, they tell us that man, years and years ago, was a brute beast evolving from apes, and that we were really pretty dumb, dragging our knuckles on the ground and hitting our women over the head and dragging them off into the cave, And so, if your view of the world, or your world view, is based upon evolution, and then you look at this Great Pyramid out here, this great building, and you listen to these numbers over here, they don't add up. They don't add up. Now, I'm a general contractor, and I build buildings. And when we build a house, and if that house is plus or minus an inch, that's plenty good enough. And when we get them a little out of square, they're 2-3 inches out of square, no big deal. We just cover it up, by dividing the inch or the 3 inches, in half, and then when we put the roofing on, we fudge a little bit over here at the bottom, and then we fudge a little bit up there at the opposite top, and when you look at it, you can't see it. It's not that big a deal. And that's building a house. Now, the Great Pyramid, to show you how accurate it is. In 1964, they developed, I don't know who it was, but somebody developed what they call a laser transit. Now, we've had transits, for hundreds of years. An eyepiece, a telescope, in which we could put a man out there in the field, 100, 200, 300, 400 feet out there. We can measure elevations with a stick, and we can measure straight lines and things like that. It's been going on for a long time. So we've been surveying and measuring, for centuries. But the accuracy of it wasn't all that great. And so we've been making maps, for hundreds of years. But the maps, aren't exactly accurate. And so as time progresses along, we've been getting more accurate maps. And so about 1964, somebody comes up with a new type of transit, and it's called the laser transit, and it's much more accurate, than the old transits. And so as time progresses along, technology improves, and we get more accurate readings. And so somebody went over to the Great Pyramid and they measured it up, and they'll see, well, how square is it? Now, the thing sits on 14 acres. So it's not like building a house. I mean, an acre is 43,560 square feet. So if you can remember, that's about 40,000 square feet. If you've got a house that sits on 10,000 square foot lot, that's a quarter of an acre. You're going round numbers. 11,000 square feet would be a little closer. So if your lot's 11,000 square feet, now, that's a quarter of an acre, and then on that house you build a house, and if you can build that house within an inch or two of square, that's pretty good, and this is modern times. Well, the Great Pyramid sits on 14 acres. Let's just take 14 times 4. 14 times 4. That's 56 times bigger than your lot. 56 times bigger. And if your lot, is an eighth of an acre over here, well, then it's about 112 times bigger. And the thing measures corner to corner on all four corners within 1/2 inch of absolute square. 1/2 inch on 14 acres. Now, like I said, I'm an old-timey general contractor, and I look at that and I say, my God, I couldn't build a house that close. I couldn't build a house on your lot to plus or minus 1/2 inch. Now, it could be done. I mean, if we wanted to spend the time, effort, energy, and the money, we could build a house plumb. I don't know that you could build it out of wood and make it plumb, but I think we probably, if we put our minds to it, we could probably do that out of some other material. Now, the reason I say that that's really a spectacular concept is because when I went to school, they told us that in ancient times, these people, they didn't have pulleys. They didn't have Caterpillar tractors. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have transits. There was a company back in 1964 also that said that if they were going to build the Great Pyramid, that they could build the Great Pyramid, duplicate it the way it is, and they could mine the block from 2,500 miles away, ship it by rail and barge and boat, build the thing, and put the capstone on it. Now that pyramid's sitting up there now without any capstone. Well, this company said that they could put it on there, and then they could do it for $32 billion, and that's a $32 billion. Now that's in 1964 dollars. If you were going to multiply that out, you'd have to double it from 1980 to the present time, so that'd be 64 billion. And then you'd have to probably double that again from 1960 to 1980. I don't know what the inflation rate was in that 20 years, but I guess it was double again. So that'd be 64, and then we got to double again to 128. So talking about it in today's dollars, it'd be about $128 billion. That's a bunch of money. Now, people don't normally go out and just spend $128 billion bucks, just to be spending money or just to be building something. I mean, when you build a building, like the trade towers or the Empire State Building or something like that, there's got to be a return. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a purpose behind it. And that's a big building. And by the way, the building is built with expansion joints. For those of you that might not know what that is, when the sun shines on the Golden Gate Bridge, it's built out of steel, and it expands. And you've got to have expansion joints. So when you're driving on the deck of the bridge, you'll cross over a grate. And that grate is interlocking like the fingers on your hands. And as the sun shines on the steel, it expands and contracts an inch or 2 or 3 or 5. I don't know how much it expands, but it's got an expansion joint in there. Well, the Great Pyramid, when the sun shines on one side of it, it will expand faster, expand more than on the side where the sun isn't shining. So you've got to have a modality for the entire building to expand, or at least that outer shell to expand and contract. And they've got grooves. The builders of the Great Pyramids understood expansion and contraction. And so they build it into the Great Pyramid. Nothing's been there for several thousand years, and it hasn't cracked and broken and fallen down. That's amazing. The Empire State Building hasn't been there for several thousand years, neither has the Golden Gate Bridge or the Bay Bridge. And of course the Twin Towers, they didn't last very long. Now, it would say to me that the people who built the Great Pyramid must have had at least the same technology that we had in 1964 to measure it. Just my common sense says to me, if we couldn't measure the damn thing until 1964, because we didn't have a laser transit, then the people that built it had to have at least had the technology of a laser transit to build it. Because up until 1964, boys and girls, we couldn't duplicate it without the laser transit. So whether the guys who built the thing, and I was told this one time, I said, well, how did they level it up? Now the thing sits plumb. It's level. And now they got satellites out there in space with lasers, and they can shoot and they can measure things now pretty darn accurately, and they kind of marvel. I do. I'm an old-timey general contractor, and I got to tell you, I don't think I could build an outhouse that close. I've got 2 outhouses out here, and they're not plus or minus a half an inch. First of all, nobody would spend the time trying to make it that close. It isn't necessary. But then when this thing sits on 14 acres and it's plus or minus plumb, and then it's plus or minus a half inch on 4 corners, sitting on 14 acres, which is bigger than the Empire State Building, which is bigger than the Twin Towers, which is more accurate than either. You got to sit there and say, hey, wait a minute. These guys were not savages dragging their knuckles on the back of the ground. These were not Cro-Magnons. We can't duplicate the thing today. Now, that tells me they got to be smarter than we are. Now, if we could duplicate the thing today, we'd have 4 or 5 of them sitting out there. And you don't see anybody building those today. Now, there had to be a reason for it. I don't know what the reason was. And that's another thing. People don't spend $32, $64, or $128 billion, building the most massive building that's ever been constructed in the history of mankind without a purpose. We haven't got a clue. Can't figure it out. Nobody's spending $128 billion today to build something over there in Washington, D.C. to commemorate World War II. We don't have the money, number one. Number two, if we had the money, we couldn't duplicate it. Don't know how. We don't know how they did it. Well, the guy that wrote the book, Dead Men's Secrets, his name is Jonathan Gray. He hits upon this very subject matter over here. In fact, it isn't just the Great Pyramid. he hits upon a number of areas of life, like geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, social organization, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items, clothing, art, medicine, flight, space travel, ancient science, and civilization. Can you imagine space travel before Christ? Ancient science before Christ, civilization before Christ, flight, medicine, art, and clothing before Christ, equal to or superior to anything that we have today. Now, right away, somebody says, well, if that were true, we would have heard about it from archaeology. You would? You would? Excuse me. In 1940, there was a skeleton up here in the museum in Chicago. I think they call it the Museum of Natural History. It was a 14-foot skeleton. Now, the Bible says there were giants on earth in those days. This is back in Genesis chapter 5, I believe it is, or 6. There were giants on earth in those days. That does not fit with the theory of evolution. It doesn't fit with modern science. Now, go into that museum today, and you're not going to find that 14-foot skeleton that was there in 1940. I don't know what happened to it. I'm just telling you that in 1940 it was there. Today it's gone. It doesn't fit with the theory of evolution, and I first of all want to tell you that that is not science and that is not academic. That is propaganda. If it doesn't fit with your theory, what you do is you destroy it. You eliminate it. Get rid of it. And that's not honest. And then it's not intellectual. So when I hear stories like that, I say to myself, well, why would archaeology, why would science, why would people in museums want to deliberately destroy the evidence? I mean, if there were giants, then why don't we say, well, gosh, there were giants. That's the truth. How many of these giants were there? Well, now, it could be that the 14-foot giant was just an anomaly. You know, it happens once in a while. You look in the Guinness Book of Records, there was a guy that was just, I think it was 8'11", or 8'10.5" or something, just a shade under 9 feet tall. And the Bible talks about a guy named Goliath. You know, there's David and Goliath. There's a Bible story there. Well, Goliath was 9'6". And compared to the giants described in the Bible, Goliath was a midget. You know, 9 feet is pretty tall when you're comparing it to a 6-foot man, but 14 feet. And there was the story of a guy named King Og, and his bedstead was 14 feet. So the 14-foot skeleton that was in the Chicago Museum was an average run-of-the-mill 14-foot skeleton. There were people that were 15, 16 feet tall. And I suppose there were people that were 9, 10, 11, 12 feet tall, but they're all big. They're big guys. Now, are there any other skeletons beside that one in the Museum of Natural History in Chicago? And the answer is yes, by the hundreds. They've been discovered all over the world. And Dead Men Secrets identifies the locations of those finds. And I didn't know that before. So I had heard of the Great Pyramid. I had heard of the Nazca monuments out here in the desert where they get spiders and monkeys, you know, that are miles across, 6, 8 miles across. And big buildings with building blocks that weigh 50 tons down in Peru and Ecuador. And cities that are built on cliffs and on top of mountains, you know. And those are just one here and one there and one. It makes you think, well, my God, were there people out here in ancient times smarter than we are today, more technologically advanced? Did they have ships that could go across the oceans? Before the flood, flying in jet airplanes, they had medicine equal to today, art, clothing, and mechanical devices that have been dug up, but they don't fit the theory of evolution. See, evolution is a fairy tale for adults that tells us once upon a time, long, long ago and far, far away. And then they proceed to tell us the story about how billions and billions of years ago, thus and such occurred. Pure fantasy. There isn't a shred of evidence, not a shred of proof. No scientific tests can be duplicated. And, you know, if people want to believe that, that's fine. There's no problem with that. People believe in religion. I kind of watch people, you know, religious people. They scare the hell out of me, and I watch them as far away as I can get from them. And then they believe in superstition. And rational people who attach themselves to science, they attach themselves to another superstition called evolution. And they call that science. I look at both of them and I say, oh my God, I got one superstitious bunch on the one hand, and I look over here and I got another superstitious bunch on the other hand. And neither side can ever come to an actual grasp of truth and understanding. You know, how did it actually happen? So in order for us to do that, if we're going to arrive at the truth, we got to actually come to grips with 14-foot skeletons. and buildings that are so big and so massive that we can't duplicate them today, and ask the question, well, how did those people build that? Who was here to do that? We look at Stonehenge, in amazement to this day, and say, how in the world did those people get 30-ton blocks of rock sitting up there on top of that? That would be a whale of a feat. It can be duplicated. We could do Stonehenge. But hey, boys and girls, there's a lot of buildings around the world that we can't duplicate today. There's a block of rock in a wall down in Ecuador that weighs 200,000 tons. It's a dressed rock. It's a square. I say square, it's rectangular, but it's got corners to it. It's got 8 corners. And these corners, are exact. It didn't just evolve this way. If you're out here walking around, and you see a block of rock over here and this thing is square, and you measure it up and it's got the same measurements all around it, you can be pretty sure that some intelligence over here squared that thing up. Here's the crazy part of it. Do you know how much 200,000 tons is? That's a lot of weight. That's a big chunk. Let me describe it. The Titanic, that big ship, the Titanic, and the Queen Mary, these big merchant ships. Well, those big luxury liners weigh about 40,000 tons. 40,000 tons. All right, now let's pull the Queen Mary into a shipyard, and let's just stick it under a couple of cranes, and let's just pick it up and set it on the ground. Do you think that there's any place in the world that there's a crane big enough to pick up a ship like the Queen Mary? Well, I'm here to tell you that there isn't. So when they want to work on a ship that big, what they have to do is run it into what they call a dry dock. And that's a big hole in the ground that they can flood with water. They can float the thing in, and then they let the water out of it, and the thing settles down on the bottom, and then they can go in there and they go to work on it. So when we want to work on a ship, we have to put it in a dry dock. You can't pick it up. Now, there are places that have cranes that pick up fishing boats and just pick them up out of the water and stick them over here on the ground, and then they work on them, and then they pick them up off the ground, and they set them back in the water. Fishing boats and things like that. Now, let's go down here. I told you there's a rock here that's now 200,000 tons. There's lots of rocks that are 50,000 tons. That's as big as or bigger than the Queen Mary. There's lots of rocks that weigh 200 tons. They go anywhere from 3, 6, 16, 30, 50 tons, things like that. And these rocks are set into walls, and they're dressed. Now, some of them are square. Some of them are odd shapes, and then the odd shape fits with the next rock, and it's cut in an odd shape to fit. Kind of like looking at a puzzle. The odd shapes that go into a jigsaw puzzle? And remember that the tab has to fit into a corresponding hole. And then when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, if you'll think about it, yeah, it's true, you got a tab and you got a hole, but they don't fit together perfectly. So if they don't fit together perfectly, well, then obviously it doesn't go there. All right, well, these rocks are built like a jigsaw puzzle. They're so close together you can't stick a knife blade between them. So they were cut. There isn't any technology today that can cut rock irregularly and then put them together. None. Doesn't exist. And yet there they are. Now, those people that did that were smarter than we are today. They had a greater technology than we have today. And the Bible talks about that, and the Bible talks about space flight. The Bible talks about flight. And yet your preacher doesn't talk about that because if he did, he wouldn't last long as your preacher. Because he subscribes to evolutionary philosophy, and he doesn't tell you everything that's in the Bible. And unless you read it for yourself, you wouldn't know that. And most religious people don't read the Bible. They haven't got a clue. So atheists and agnostics and evolutionists, they don't read the Bible because they don't want to. The religious guys, they don't read the Bible because I'm not sure that they're capable. I mean, everybody's got one, but they don't read it. And if they read it, they don't believe what it says. I mean, time and time again, you take a look at people's actions, in life. People don't practice Exodus chapter 12. Jesus asked the question, he said, well, why do you people call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? That's because they've got a different God, they've got a different religion, they've got a different program over here that they follow. They don't follow the Scripture. Well, anyway, Jonathan Gray over here writes a book called Dead Men's Secrets. And I want to tell you a little story here, pertinently. William Prescott, the great archaeologist, reminds us that a nation may pass away and leave only the memory of its existence, but the stories of science that it has gathered up will endure forever. You see, folklore is a fossil of history. It preserves history in the guise of colorful tales. Far from being a collection of fables, It is a recital of actual past events, even though from generation to generation some facts have become distorted or forgotten. Professor I.A. Efremov of the Soviet Union cautions that historians must pay more respect to ancient traditions and folklore, and he accuses Western science of snobbishness in rejecting the tales of the common people. We must face it, legends are usually based on hardcore fact. Take the legend of Troy, for instance. No scholar ever took the Iliad or the Odyssey of Homer as history. But Schliemann, putting faith in it, discovered the mythical city of Troy. The Iliad spoke of a cup decorated with doves, which Odysseus used. In a shaft, Schliemann found the 3,600-year-old cup. Herodias told a fabulous story of a distant country where griffins guarded a golden treasure. This land, Altai or Kim-Shan, has now been found, together with ancient gold mines and decorations from a high culture, prominently display the griffin. This vague myth is now seen to be a fact. Mexican Indian legends spoke of a sacred well of sacrifice into which maidens and jewelry were hurled. Historians dismiss this as a mere tale, until the well at Chichen Itza was discovered in the 19th century. Now, more than any document, the Bible has been assailed as a collection of fanciful myths. And yet, to the embarrassment of its critics, archaeological discoveries have proved time and time again that the fabled cities, mythical persons, and impossible events were not only true, but they were in fact reliable historical reporting in every detail. And indeed, the Bible can now be regarded as the most accurate and the most trustworthy source of history that we possess. All right, so these legends are usually based upon hardcore fact. Now, our ancestral memory of the Golden Era, if we were to credit the collective testimony of all ancient races, man's early history was truly an incredible history. It was a golden age of advanced civilization, of original giants who had superior intelligence and technology. This appears to have been a universal truth known to everyone in ancient times. Sacred records affirm that at the very beginning, soon after the fall from paradise, men possessed extraordinary mental abilities. Beginning with the raw earth, they mastered a high level of civilization and technology in just the first 6 generations of their existence. In that short time, they were able to build cities, play complex musical instruments, and smelt metals. Indeed, with their scientific complexities, these earliest men, it seems, were no fools. We might well wonder to what degree they further developed and refined this technology. In the final few centuries before the flood struck, were the miracles of science as common as they are now? A perfectly valid question, I would think. Now imagine, if you can, paved rainbow cities whose houses of crystal reflected every special hue, and we're talking about air travel, computers, and plastics. Now, did you know that when Alexander Graham Bell gave us the telephone, he said that it had been done before? The old devices have been reinvented, he observed. Yes, you read it right. That's exactly what Bell said. He said, in fact, the question was pressed further by the eminent British scientist Frederick Soddy. He's a winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, and he wondered whether the ancients might not only have attained our present knowledge, but a power hitherto unmastered by us at this time. Now, there are physical remains also. So, in our quest here for the truth concerning ancient civilizations, we've got to have some physical evidence. As a jurist or a lawyer, if we went into court and we wanted to prove our theory or prove our side of the case, we'd have to have some kind of evidence. We call them exhibits, physical evidence. Now, where did Bell and Soddy get their information? Well, quite possibly from some rusty old records. Nevertheless, our quest is not based on ancient texts and reports, but on accepted scientific discoveries. There are recently discovered artifacts that cannot be dismissed, namely objects of metal sitting in museums today that are unquestionably made in the ancient world that would have required very advanced technology to produce, a technology not to be repeated until our day today. The weight of evidence grows daily, evidence that all of the major secrets of modern technology were known and then forgotten long ago. Evidence that early man did create a society that surpassed ours in all aspects of development. The entire world is really a dead man's tomb. It's a treasure hunter's paradise. As we prize or we open the coffin, suspense builds. And slowly, we are lifting the lid on a lost technology which almost smacks of science fiction. We come face to face with such absurdities as brain transplants, colonies on Mars, and invisible men. And then we wonder, what's next? Well, admittedly, such concepts almost strain credibility. And we're tempted to ask, could the ancients have really advanced so far? It may help to consider our own age. As recently as 100 years ago, were not most of today's inventions totally unknown, even unbelievable? Since then, the spawning has been very sudden and very rapid. And what's more, the present age of basic discoveries is hardly at its end. It is forecast that just 15 years in the future, the accumulated knowledge that we have today will double in just 15 years. Now, can you grasp what that means? How then can one possibly conceive of the state of knowledge attained by the antediluvians before the deluge struck? Let me ask you this question. Think about this for a second. In the Bible, it tells us that they were artificers in brass and iron in Genesis chapter 4. An artificer in brass and iron. Let's go back to Columbus. No, we look back 500 years and we say, well, it's the Middle Ages, and technology wasn't as advanced as it is today, but we had ships, and we had metallurgy, we had swords, and they had some cannons, they had guns, they knew about gunpowder. Well, in Columbus's day, in 1500, they were still casting cannon in sand. A turret lathe had not been invented yet. Metalworking tools, such as lathes, were yet to be discovered in the future. Now, if we were casting cannon in sand 500 years ago, and within 500 years we're putting men on the moon, if in Genesis 4 they already had advanced metallurgy, that is, the mixing of metals together, which is advanced beyond casting cannon in sand, couldn't they do the same thing in 500 years? Now, the amount of time from Adam and Eve until the flood was 1,656 years. So if in the first 1,100 years, they were able to reach metallurgy, then they had 556 years left with which to duplicate the technology that we have today. Now, there's an obscure scripture here in the Bible. I thought I'd point this one out. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 30. That anticipates space travel. I looked at this some years back, and I kind of marveled, and I said, why would God even put such a thing in there unless he was already familiar with? In verse 4 it says, if any of yours be driven out unto the outmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord your God gather you, and from thence shall he fetch you. How far out into the heavens has man traveled that he has been lost on other planets or on other moons, like, say, our moon or Mars? I don't know. It never entered our vocabulary until the last 50 years. It's been in my lifetime. When I was a kid, we used to read the comics, and there was a guy by the name of Flash Gordon. That was science fiction. That was in the 1950s. Nobody ever thought that anybody was going to travel to the moon, or build a space station, or put satellites up in the air with which we could bounce radio waves off of and telephone calls. Never occurred to anybody. We had Dick Tracy with a watch, a two-way communication watch. Today we all have cell phones. Dick Tracy, science fiction, 1950. He's got a two-way wrist radio. Today everybody's got a cell phone talking with people anywhere in the world. Now, we did that in the last 50 years or so. And notice that the technology that we have here today, in the world today, just take a look around you, computers, automobiles, airplanes, jet airplanes. We didn't have that 100 years ago. Go back 200 years. Look what has been accomplished over the past 200 years, and ask yourself, if these people were already advanced in metallurgy prior to, this is BC, this is way before the flood, for crying out loud, this is before Noah's Ark. Now, I know, you go to the movies and you look at the movie, Noah's Ark, or you look at the movies that are produced by Cecil B. DeMille, in Egyptian times, and we say, hey, these people are barbarians. They're ancient. They don't have technology. They're building pyramids that we can't duplicate today. They're building buildings and monuments that we don't have a technology to do. But they're dragging their knuckles on the ground and hitting their women over the head and dragging them off. That's preposterous poppycock. It's insane. Doesn't add up with the physical evidence. I mean, that pyramid is sitting there, boys and girls, like it or lump it. It's there. We can't build one today. We don't have the money. There isn't anybody in the world, including the United States of America, has got the money to duplicate that Great Pyramid. Technologically, we could do it today, but it wasn't until 1964 that we were able to do it. Now, those people back in those days, they built that thing. And here's the Bible talking about space travel here in Deuteronomy 30, verse 4. And I'm sitting there saying, if we can come to space travel, if we can come to jet engine flight in 100 years, from 1900 to 2000, there isn't too much of a stretch of my imagination to see somebody doing this prior to the flood. And do we have any physical evidence of it? Oh, you betcha we do. Physical evidence abounds, not 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, but by the hundreds. By the hundreds. For instance, he's got some sections in here. I'm going to flip over here to, I guess, number 16. Let me get to chapter 16 here. And the one that as a contractor, the one that I was really surprised to see, there are 64 examples of construction techniques that have not been duplicated until the 20th century. That's not the buildings themselves. That's the techniques, like concrete. We think of cement today, building the Empire State Building with steel and concrete, as being something new and modern that we just came up with in the last 100 years. You go back here 200 years, you didn't see any Empire State Buildings. Now, that's a modern technology. There's some buildings that have been built out here in the hinterlands, and there's microscopes. Did you know that in Moses' time they had microscopes? I was absolutely amazed. Glasswork and microscopes. I'm going to give you some examples. 24 examples of glasswork and microscopes sit in the museums today, not on display. They sit down in the basements, hidden away so that you can't see them. Like the skeleton of the 14-foot giant up in Chicago. They're not on display. They exist. They were found. They've been recorded. We have the pictures of it. We know that they're there. But they don't fit the theory of evolution. And anything that doesn't fit with evolution is not put on display. Nobody has an explanation for it. Well, there's an explanation. When you see something like a 200,000-ton block of rock that is set in position, somebody had the technology to make it, pick it up, move it, and set it into place. We can't do that today. And since we can't explain that, and our fairy tale dream world says that we're evolving better and better, smarter and smarter, it doesn't fit with the evolution fairy tale. So then we ignore it. We hide it. We pretend it doesn't exist. And as I said, that's not science, and it's not academic. It's just propaganda. So we're in chapter 16, and we've got some buildings. I want to point out a couple of 3 buildings here. We've got about 10 minutes. So. A startling surprise awaited Captain Don Henry on that particular day in 1976. He was 40 miles off the southern coast of Florida directing sonar readings on the ocean floor. Suddenly, an immense pyramid-shaped structure showed up. It was 300 feet below the surface. Subsequent underwater closed-circuit TV was to show the pyramid to be about 420 feet high. It's a veritable skyscraper, nearly the size of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. When 12 other pyramids turned up on a NASA satellite photograph of the Amazon jungle. Noted author Charles Berlitz and Dr. Manson Valentine, curator of the Miami Science Museum, excitedly organized a major scientific expedition to the underwater pyramid, the first of its kind, which set out with a crack team of 15 archaeologists, researchers, and divers early in August of 1978. At the same time, a NASA-supported expedition led by Florida explorer Philip Miller set out for the Amazon jungles of Peru, accompanied by a documentary film team to investigate the foliage-covered pyramids found there. I'm intrigued by an apparent relationship here. Huge ruins throughout the world generally resemble each other in construction, as well as in geographical and astronomical alignment. What is more, constructions which are technologically impossible today face us. precise construction, and colossal size indicate that the builders had unknown techniques and energy sources at their disposal. It makes one feel that these magnificent, time-defying ruins that still exist after 4,000 years can hardly be the work of primitive barbarians. Surely, they are the scientific instruments of an advanced universal civilization. So join me on a grand tour, and you'll see what I mean. Things that can't happen have happened here. The site is built 12,000 feet above sea level. This is very oxygen-poor air in which the slightest exertion can cause nausea and worse, and yet blocks of up to 200 tons were maneuvered over distances of up to 90 miles in rarefied air. This is not possible by muscular strength. This grand complex was built with a technical skill embarrassing to us and by a method which is totally unknown to us today. Here was a city of startling dimensions. Acres and acres lie covered with truncated pyramids, artificial hills, lines of monoliths, platforms, underground rooms, and giant gates which incorporate architecture beyond our technical scope today. Many large gateways were built from a single stone. The Gate of the Sun is the biggest carved monolith in the world. It is a single block of rock, 10 feet high and 6 feet wide. The size of some of the buildings is astonishing. The fortress of Akapana, 650 by 496 feet, was once a pyramid 167 feet high. The Sun Temple was on a platform 440 feet long by 390 feet wide, composed of blocks of rock 100 to 200 tons each. Walls of the temple complex itself had blocks of 60 tons each. Steps of the stone stairway were 50 tons apiece. Here were terraced temples like those of faraway Babylon and Nineveh. The walls of the palace were 220 feet long by 180 feet wide. Its throne room was 160 feet long by 130 feet wide. The steps from the palace entrance were washed by the lake now receding and 15 miles away. The paved court under our feet is 80 feet square, with a covered gallery 45 feet on one side. Court and hall are one single block of dressed stone. One single block. Building blocks. One is 36 feet long, 7 feet wide, fitted without lime or mortar and without any joint showing. Nearly every stone is accurately cut and polished, nicked, mortised, and occasionally even beveled. Water conduits have a completely modem shape with smooth cross-sections, polished inner and outer surfaces, and accurate edges. See these half pipes? They have grooves and corresponding protrusions that fit together. Plundered Spanish invaders stole the interlocking copper or silver keys which secured the stonework from earthquake damage until they had survived for thousands of years. Subsequent earthquakes leveled the structures. As late as the 19th century, there were imposing colonnades to admire, of which sadly there is now no trace. Many of the great buildings were dynamited, and then untold treasures disappeared. One 24-foot statue remains. But the records are there. You see, when the Spanish got there, they made records of it. And then they tore them down, blew them up to salvage the gold, silver, and the metals, shipped them off to Spain. Here's the point. Here are buildings at 12,000 feet in Bolivia that we could not build today, let alone at 12,000 feet. And we're being told, in our movies and in our books, that these great monuments were built by slave labor, and they were built by hand, without wheels, without pulleys, just by pure muscle. That's preposterous poppycock. You talk about fantasy world. Hey, you talk about fairy tales. That's a fairy tale. But it's better than that. All right, we are reviewing the book called Dead Men's Secrets. So last time I gave you an introduction, and I said, hey, listen, there's some big monuments around the world. In fact, in this chapter 16, there are 57 of these examples of architectural marvels and wonders that are built around the world that we can't build today. You know, it's one thing to say, well, yeah, we could duplicate that today, but when you've got monuments out here, as I pointed out last time, you got a block of rock that weighs 200,000, not 200 tons, 200,000 tons, which is 5 Queen Marys. Somebody quarried that block of rock and then moved it and set it in place. There isn't anybody in the world today that can do that. The entire Russian apparatus, the American, the Russians, the French, the British, the Europeans, the Chinese, all combined, can't pick it up and move it. Now, somebody did that past tense. Now, how'd they do that? We don't know. We ain't got a clue. And there's 57 of those stories here in the book. It's called Dead Men's Secrets. You can probably get a copy of it down at Barnes & Noble. It's fairly new. It's 2004. The author's name is Jonathan Gray. And it's put out by an outfit called, kind of an odd publisher here. I've never heard this name before. They call themselves Teach Services Incorporated. Published by Teach Services Incorporated. They got a webpage. It's www.teachservices.com. And it's TEACHS is in capitals, and ERVICES.com is in lowercase. It's the way they've got it here in the book. I'm very impressed by the book. I have heard about these stories. I have heard about batteries in the Museum of Baghdad. And I've heard of airplanes out of Ecuador, model airplanes, you know, little models of airplanes that were jets. You know, and today we would look at that and say, my God, that's a jet airplane. And made out of silver, you know, little ornaments and things like that. And you hear about these little stories, the 14-foot skeleton I told you about last time that was in the museum up in Chicago, disappeared. And this author points out that the Smithsonian is sitting on warehouses full of this stuff. And they won't put it out. They haven't destroyed it. In some cases they have. It's been destroyed, but much of it is in the warehouses, and they're not putting it out on display. It doesn't fit evolution, and if it doesn't fit evolution, then we don't put it up. And so this guy wrote a book. See how many pages are in here. It's a pretty thick book. It's at 300 pages. Come on, page numbers. Show me your stuff here. Oh, my God. Tell me there's no page numbers. Here we are, 350. Yeah, it's 350 pages or more. 350 pages, and it talks about geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, social organization, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items, clothing, art, medicine, flight, space travel, ancient science and civilization, all of it documented, all of it with physical evidence that we have uncovered over the last 200, 300, 400 years. And it's sitting around in warehouses, being carefully hidden, being carefully concealed, but it's all well documented. And he's done a very professional job, footnoted it, showed you the sources. I got to tell you this story. Now, last program I told you about a 12,000-foot elevation here in the Andes Mountains, where they've got this fantastic city over here with the ruins and so on, well documented by the Spanish when they got in there. They blew it up and destroyed most of it. Some of it, I mean, the site's still there. Most of the rocks are still there. They got pictures in the book here of the rocks. The tragedy of it was the destruction that was wrought by the Spanish. They just came in there and just tore it all to hell. Not exactly clear why they tore it all up. It didn't all have gold and silver in it, but much of it did, and they robbed it and stole from it. Did you know that there are pyramids in the world that are bigger than the Great Pyramid of Cheops? Now, if you're like me, you heard that the Great Pyramid of Egypt is the biggest pyramid in the world. Down in Mexico City, 40 miles out of town, there's a couple of pyramids called the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. I saw those as a kid. I was about 20 years old or so. I went down there and I looked at those pyramids, and my God, these two pyramids look just like the pyramids over in Egypt. How could these people over here in the New World be building pyramids that look just like the pyramids in Egypt unless they had had some kind of communication? I mean, I can see people building a pyramid, on both sides of the oceans, but you got to have, if they look alike, they got to look different, if they never had any communication. If they look exactly alike, well, then obviously one saw the other and copied it. I don't know who copied what from who, but I'm pointing out that these pyramids are all over the world. It isn't just here in the New World or in the Maya lands or the Aztecs and so on, but hell, these pyramids are in China. They're in Australia. They're in the United States of America. Did you know we got 9 pyramids over here in the United States of America, sitting over in Illinois? I never read about those pyramids here in the United States when I went to school. I never heard a word about them. And one day my wife said, my wife is from Illinois, and she said, have you ever heard of the pyramids in Illinois? I looked at her like, pyramids? She says, yeah, they're about the same size as the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt, and there's 9 of them in Illinois. And I looked at her like, lady, you got to be out of your mind. There's no pyramids in America. If there were, I would have heard about it when I went to school. And she said, well, turn left here. Let's go take a look at one. So we drove out into the countryside. And here's this great big mountain. There are parks. You know, the state of Illinois has a park there. I climbed to the top of one of them. The top of the pyramid, the top of this pyramid in Illinois, is 1/2 acre in size. That's the top. The top is a 1/2 acre. It's bigger than your house. It's bigger than your lot for most of you people out there. I was looking on the computer last night, and we were taking a look at houses in the Los Angeles area, and there's lots, 7,000-foot lot, 8,000-foot lot, 6,000-foot lot. I mean, you people live on pieces of ground that aren't as big as the top of this pyramid. I'm not talking the bottom of the pyramid. I mean the top of it. And then yet it sits on acres and acres of land, and it's 400 feet tall, and it's built out of dirt, and somebody packed all that dirt up there. I'm telling you, boys and girls, that if you had to go out here and build that pyramid today, if you called the Caterpillar Tractor Company, you'd have to have a major contracting outfit like Guy F. Atkinson to come out there and build something like that. You know, we look at it and we say, oh, well, just a bunch of Indians with a bunch of baskets carrying dirt stacked it up there. There's no Indian tribes around here ever claimed that they built that thing. It was there when they arrived. That's what they're telling them. Well, anyway, here, listen to this. The tallest building in the world until this century, until the 21st century, and still the most massive structure on Earth, is an ancient pyramid 120 stories high. 120 stories. All right, now the Great Pyramid is 450 feet high. That's 450 times 10 is 4,500 feet. Is that right? No. That's I think the Great Pyramid of Cheops, if I remember, is 450 feet divided by 10. Yeah, that's 45 stories. Now remember the Twin Towers in New York, the Twin Towers, they're 110 stories tall. Remember that? I think they were 1,100 feet, as I recall, because there's 10 feet to a story, no round numbers. So you got 110 times 10. Yeah, they're 1,100 feet tall. All right. This pyramid is sitting in China today. Today, in China. You know, where they find all these great things every once in a while. Well, it stands on a long, desolate, flat stretch of land 40 miles west of the ancient capital, Xianfu, on an old dirt road, caravan trail, and crosses from Peking, or Beijing they call it today, to the Mediterranean. About 2,000 feet at the base, it rises some 1,200 feet. All right, it's 2,000 feet at the base, and it rises 1,200 feet. 1,200 feet. The Great Pyramid in Egypt, 450 feet. This one rises 1,200 feet. There are actually 7 pyramids, flat-topped, with 3 carved giants resting along the outer edges. The 4 faces of the pyramids are, like so many ancient structures, aligned to the compass points. Traces of color remain on the sides, indicating that colors that were given to each side: east, aqua green; south, red; west, black; north, white; and on the flat tops, traces of yellow. A pair of American adventurers who roamed Asia between the 2 world wars, R.C. Anderson and Frank Shearer, were shown these pyramids, and Anderson visited Egypt's pyramids in 1970 and believed himself to be the only man living to have seen both the Chinese and the Egyptian pyramids. In 1946, a U.S. Army airplane crew rediscovered and photographed these pyramids from the air. Place 26 skyscrapers the size of the Empire State Building, and you have the volume of the largest Shensi pyramid. All right, you ever hear of that? I hadn't either. So I wanted to tell you. Some skyscrapers, heights, and constructions in China equivalent to 120 stories, Ecuador 60 stories, Egypt 48, Bermuda seabed 42, Italy 35, Iraq 30, Guatemala 23, India 22, Mexico 21, Kampuchea, Kampuchea 20, Arabia 20, and Turkey 20. Now these are all buildings or monuments in China, Ecuador, Egypt, Bermuda, Italy, Iraq, Guatemala, India, Mexico, Kampuchea, wherever that is, I can't tell you. If you want to check me out, Kampuchea, probably some new country in Africa, Arabia, and Turkey, 20-story tall buildings. Hell, we weren't building 20-story buildings until 1900. And they're still here. These structures, by the way, boys and girls, have withstood time for thousands of years. And it's thought that all of these structures are built before Noah's flood and survived the flood. Or they were built right after the flood in the period of time between Noah and the Tower of Babel and up to the time of Abraham, which would have been around 2000 BC. Now, some of these monuments went through the flood. I would guess they survived the flood. I could be wrong about that. They may have all been built on this side of the flood, every last one of them. But my guess is that some of these things, especially up in the Andes Mountains, unless, of course, they had that technology after the flood and then it was destroyed after the flood, which this guy points out could well be the case. Now, this is the section on construction, large-scale construction. There's another section in here that's called construction techniques. It's chapter 17. There's 64 examples of construction techniques. He starts off by saying, it is a human impossibility, gasped Hyatt Verrill. And he's right, and yet it happened. The great mountains of the Peruvian Andes are awesome enough until you gaze up those extremely steep slopes, and you perceive the death-defying ruins perched on top of these mountaintops. The setting is terrifyingly wild, mountains miles high, vanishing into the sky, notched with narrow ledges, slashed with ravines and bottomless gorges. Waterfalls of an awesome beauty plunge from these immaculate snowy peaks down into the damp, unknown depths of the canyons. So rare is the air that even the mules are obliged to stop every 10 paces to catch their breath. Here at the frontiers of the impossible, a vanished civilization set gems in stone, astonishing and astoundingly assembled polygonal walls suspended over the abyss. They carved practically vertical stairways up stupendous precipices. High in the clouds rises one acrobatic stairway of 64 steps, which had to be carved in a place where one could only get a toehold for support. Another comprises 600 steps. Just imagine that. And then here are the pictures of these stairways up these mountains. Now, these ingenious jewels, or jewelers in rock, ascended a dizzying mountain no wider than the blade of a sword, and topped it with watchtowers and walls pierced with lookouts. The mountain drops away so abruptly that if a workman slipped, his body would not hit the bottom for 3,000 feet. Today, on all sides, the ruins of temples, fortresses, and towers surmount the peaks and cling to the vertical sides of the canyons like ivy. Overlooking a waterfall, a splendid palace rises above the fierce abyss, impossible to reach. How was this palace built? Terraces were miraculously inlaid into vertical slopes, perched over the canyon faults. How did they hoist up heavy, carved rocks by the thousands? Site after site is built atop bluffs, which are too steep to be accessible. Many seem to have been literally hurled up as though the monstrous stones flew there. A high carved niche opens out over the abyss, under a ridge shaped like the letter I. The rock was leveled and encrusted with carefully joined stone cubes. Only a daring mountaineer hanging from a rope could possibly reach it. The builder magicians, I tell you, had no sense of the impossible. Everywhere loom buildings that defy the laws of equilibrium and gravity, as well as vertigo. These are a triumph of human daring and of technology which almost smacks of science fiction. And would you believe it? Sometimes the enormous blocks were brought from quarries more than 1,000 miles away. Now, boys and girls, let me point this out. You got rock. Now, these aren't the super big rocks. These are rocks, of 10, be 3, 6, 9, 10 tons. Little rocks, about the size of the rocks that went into the Great Pyramid, the blocks of rock. But they're raised up on mountains, steep mountains, that are up around 10 to 12,000 feet in the Andes Mountains, where the air is so thin that the mules have to stop about every 10 paces to catch their breath. Now, how the hell do you build stuff like that up there in those mountains? It isn't being built by muscle labor. It's being built by some kind of machines and mechanical labor. Now, many are covered with intricate carvings. No man alive could duplicate such carvings with the stone tools that we find. As Hyatt Verrell remarks, it is not a question of skill, patience, and time. It is a human impossibility. I mean, we're just taking a look at it, boys and girls. It's there. Like it or lump it. There's the pictures of it here in the book. And I've seen this, time and time again. It was the Incas and the Aztecs, that built some of these monuments years ago. How'd they do that? Where'd they get that kind of technology? And the thing here that is so ingenious in this book are that these kinds of monuments have been found all over the world, and the genius that this guy, Jonathan Gray, has put together here is that he's rounded up not one or two odd ones like you and I have heard about, reading about it in Reader's Digest, or some odd story. I mean, he put it all together. Antarctica. There are traditions of a legendary rainbow city where the colors of the rainbow are said to have been used in the construction of the buildings and even in the paving of the streets. In Rome, glass-storied theater. Emilio Scararo, S-C-A-U-R-O, Scararo, one of Sulla's generals, had a 3-floored theater built at Rome for 80,000 spectators. The first floor of marble, the second floor of glass, the third of gilded wood. Boys and girls, 80,000 spectators. The big stadiums of baseball and football today hold 50. The big stadiums. Is there an 80,000 seat stadium here in the United States of America? If there is, send me an email and let me know where it's at. Would you? I don't think there are any 80,000 seat stadiums anywhere in the world today. I haven't heard of any. This guy in Rome built an 80,000 seat stadium. Worldwide, the use of concrete, the standard mixture of sand and cement that makes up most building blocks of today, was evidently worldwide. Listen to this. They found it at Yaxuna, Tucoba, Mexico, Cuauhcillo, Mexico, Guatemala, Quito, Ecuador, Cunza, Ecuador, Marchusni, Peru, Santa Cruz, Bolivia, Pompeii, Italy, Tourette-sur-Loup, France, Cohard, France, Crete, Sterveco, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Northwest China, Western Australia, Arkansas in the USA, Tennessee in the USA, and New Mexico in the USA are all sites where we have found ancient monuments or buildings made with cement that we didn't discover and use here in the modern world until the last 2 centuries. Well, obviously the concrete technology was available all over the world, for crying out loud, thousands of years ago. Well, how come we didn't have concrete over the last 1,000 years if it was available to those people 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago? Boys and girls, they had technology years ago. And then we lost sight of it. We went into what we call the Dark Ages. And then Julius Caesar went into Alexandria and destroyed 1 million volumes in the Alexandria Library. And the Romans, have been called the great builders, the great civilization. The Romans were the great destroyers. The Romans destroyed more than they ever built. Civilization and technology was so much greater than when the Romans were here as to defy description. The Romans never discovered anything. They destroyed what they found. And now that's one more example. Let's take a look at another one. The seabed off Bimini, but now raised into a jetty material at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Perfectly drilled 5-pointed star holes with sharply defined tips cut right through 12-foot long blocks of granite. Other huge 1/2 to 6-inch diameter round holes perfectly drilled through 12-foot thick blocks of rock. Granite, one of the most abrasive stones, wears expensive diamond drill bits down to nothing very quickly. Okay, kids. And they took it off the seabed off Bimini. It's now sitting in the jetty material at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Perfectly drilled, 5-pointed star holes with sharply defined tips, cut right through 12-foot long blocks of granite. Another huge 1/2 to 6 inch diameter round holes perfectly drilled through 12-foot thick blocks. Hey kids, we ain't had that technology over the past 100 years. Where'd those people get it thousands of years ago? 200 years, 500 years, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Where'd it come from? Did it come from savages evolving from monkeys, dragging their hands or knuckles on the ground? Come on, kids, let's grow up and get real. You know, the people over in Borneo who are still living back in the Stone Age are not doing that kind of technology. And you're sitting there saying, well, you know, we men, we're getting smarter and smarter as time goes along. Hell, we can't do that today. Over in Turkey, the boring of holes finer than the thinnest needle in a block of hard stone. Turkey. Over in Turkey. They got holes bored through stone which is finer than the thinnest needle. We can't do that today. Boring into granite rock with drills that turned 500 times faster than modern power drills today. 500 times faster. In Peru, Tibet, Egypt, and the Sudan, outer walls sheeted in gold, silver, polished marble, or sparkling white gypsum. Granite building blocks, smoothly polished like glass. Practically all buildings of antiquity have been stripped of their outer shiny surfaces, so that today we see only the raw stonework. In Syria, Babylon, Mexico, Samaria, plaster-coated surfaces. In Tibet and Babylon, decorated enamel or blue porcelain walls. Enamel, blue porcelain, Tibet and Babylon, today. China, Babylon, Mexico, and Egypt, multicolor surfaces on building exteriors. In Brazil, the use of different colored stones in the approach steps to buildings. Peru, steps polished like glass. Bolivia, colored decorated pillars. Greece and Peru, hydraulic gates opened by means of a complicated jet of water. In Crete, Etruscans in Italy, hydraulic lifts. Essential to the support of highly technological society must have been the use of massive water storage dams of modern strength. The enigma was, vestiges of these appeared not to exist. As I sought for evidence, the question kept emerging. Had river rampages obliterated all traces? Recently, one solution to this mystery fell open in quite a bizarre manner. Arkansas. Carpet rock, an area, an acre or so in size, which recently split off the Petite Jean mountainside, has a curved grid of ironwork running all through it that gives it the carpet appearance. Examination, however, shows it to be reinforced concrete with the steel gridwork still intact and little rusted, surprisingly, until you realize that it was sealed from oxidation until splitting off the cliff only recently. The whole cliff, Carpet Rock and Petite Jean, is thus seen to be one vast concrete pour, very, very old. It was the spillway of a vast dam which must have contained the White River and the Arkansas River in one great impounded lake. Now, does this sound like the work of semi-primitive men who had to use stone tools, horses, and vine ropes? No, the early builders obviously had sophisticated techniques. In later times, methods became more basic and building less ambitious. The earlier apparatus fell into disuse, gradually disintegrated, and was ultimately lost to history. That's here in Arkansas. Carpet Rock. Features of houses, 2- and 3-story dwellings. In Lebanon, Crete, Tunisia, Arizona, houses of 5 and 6 stories. Pakistan, Babylonia, expert construction in bricks, expert construction in bricks similar to our own, heated to about 900 degrees. So they weren't just making mud bricks, boys and girls, they were making fired bricks. All right, we've been taking a look at construction techniques in large-scale construction. I'm an old-timey contractor. That caught my eye right away. I see these buildings, monuments. I see concrete being used, cement being used in ancient structures. I see pyramids in China. I see pyramids in Mexico. I see pyramids in Illinois. There are pyramids all over the world. Pyramids, like the pyramids of Egypt, all over the world. Who built them and why? I suspect many of those were built before the flood. And if not, then the technology from before the flood, assuming that it was all destroyed, then was built after the flood, in that period of time between about, 2350 BC and about, maybe 1500 BC, maybe a 1,000-year period. Now, there's a lot of questions that you probably have in your mind that are answered in other chapters in the book. Always keep in mind that when I review a book, I cannot read the whole thing to you. I can't cover every page, every subject, every topic, every chapter. So I pick out of the book those chapters that are really boggle the mind. Now, there's one in here that deals with electricity. Have I got electric in here? Where is it? Geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items. There's a chapter in here that deals with electricity, and I can't put my finger on it. So I'm not going to spend the time looking for it right now. How about microscopes? Microscope. Did Moses have a microscope? Now, we know that Galileo discovered the telescope, sometime in the 1500s. And then from that, somebody got smart and they said, well, if we can see out to the moon, can we see something a little bit smaller? And then we polished glass. And then we made the glass convex and concave. And as time progressed, we finally came up with microscopes. Well, listen to this story. It's chapter 15. Glasswork. Microscope on a sexy spider. Leaping lizards. What do you make of that? Shall we bank for another run? The Peruvian flyers could scarcely believe their eyes. Spread out below all over the desolate Nazca Plateau was a mass of geometric patterns and giant pictures of birds, animals, and people as far as the eye could see. These ground-drawn objects were so numerous that they could be seen only from an airplane. Small wonder that they were not discovered until that day in 1939. Now, here are some really fabled, and you've probably heard this what do they call this thing now? Nazca, N-A-Z-C-A. I imagine if you put that into a Google search, you probably get a lot of information, Nazca. Anyway, for those of you that are uninitiated, down here in Peru, up around 15,000 feet, there's a flat plateau. And on this plateau is a spider. This spider is 6 miles across. It's built about 18 inches high out of just little rocks. Somebody went out here, and they just picked up little rocks, and they built a stone wall 18 inches high. And they built it in the outline of a spider. And the thing is 6 miles across. 6 miles. And it's in perfect size. I mean, the legs are the perfect size with the head, and the head's perfect sized with the body. And it's got all 8 legs, and they all stick out in one thing. There's monkeys and other animals, and there's people, and they're 6-8 miles across. The only way you can see, when you're on the ground and you're walking along, what you see is a stone wall. And so you walk along and you say, gee, here's a little stone wall, 18 inches. It won't keep a sheep in. It won't keep a llama in. It won't keep a cow in. And it's about 18 inches high, and it's uniform in height, and it goes out there for a long, long ways. I mean, you can look down this wall, and it curves, but you can't see what it is. You could not tell that that was a spider by looking at this walking on the ground. But in 1939, some guy's flying over it with an airplane taking pictures, and he says, oh, my God, there's a great big spider down there, and it's 6 miles across. So then they went down there, and they started measuring this thing. Who built that? And who built the monkey? And who built the people, the outlines of these people in these 18-inch stone walls? That's who built it. And then the question is, why? Why would anybody do such a thing? Because you couldn't appreciate it. You couldn't even know it was there unless you were in an airplane flying over it. You have to be in an airplane. You got to be up in the air over the top of it to see what the hell it is. That's how big it is. Now, that tells you pretty plainly that whoever built that thing built that to be looked at, and the people that are going to look at it are going to look at it from an airplane or from up in the air. Could be a gas balloon, But then if that's the case, then gas balloons were invented before 1700. First one I heard of was a hot air balloon flown in France about, 1705 or something like that. But it gets better than that. Not only do we need an airplane to see this, fashioned by an unknown pre-Inca culture and covering an area of 30 square miles, they're still unexplained. So here's 30 square miles of plateau with a number of these monuments, these monkeys, spiders, and people, laid out on the ground in 18-inch high little rock walls. We have no idea, working from the ground, anybody could execute such figures in perfect proportion. They can be observed successfully only from 1,000 feet in the air. One of the drawings depicts a spider. It has one leg deliberately lengthened and extended, and at the tip of the leg there is a small cleared area. Now, there's only one spider known